So, Princess Anne has absolutely just completely definitively ended Camilla's daughter's entire public existence entirely in about 2 incredibly tense minutes. And the massive glaring part absolutely everyone is completely still entirely missing is that Laura Lopes was highly likely set completely up entirely by her absolute own mother's chilling silence. That specific theory sounds completely insane, I intimately know, but when you actually meticulously look completely at the exact timeline, the highly strict access logs, and the highly specific way that Massive Hall was strategically arranged completely before absolutely anyone even spoke a single word, the whole messy thing rapidly starts entirely to look significantly less like a spontaneous family argument and infinitely more like a highly calculated delivery. And the absolute first person who completely understood that wasn't the frantic press, absolutely wasn't the terrified security team. It was the highly disciplined 76-year-old woman quietly standing 4 feet completely away, calmly pretending entirely to examine a boring display entirely of local potatoes. Before we officially dive deep completely into the highly specific details, I just urgently want entirely to say, if you genuinely enjoy the highly specific kind, entirely of story, where the incredibly quiet person definitively turns completely out, entirely to have completely been meticulously counting the entire massive time, take a quick second and subscribe entirely to my channel. We aggressively break completely down the massive royal family's boring paperwork, the restricted guest lists, and the incredibly small, seemingly minor decisions that explicitly explain absolutely everything entirely by Thursday, if absolutely anyone actually bothers entirely to closely look completely at them. So, here is precisely what explosively happened. The Royal Horticultural Halls entirely in Westminster. A highly routine, incredibly boring charity showcase entirely for rural development. Simple trestle tables, eager county producers, small jars entirely of local honey completely with neat handwritten labels. A quiet man completely from Cumbria standing awkwardly entirely behind a modest display entirely of seed potatoes, desperately waiting entirely for his 90 short seconds entirely of royal attention. Princess Anne was actively working the massive room the highly specific way she has flawlessly worked large rooms entirely for 50 long years. Structured navy coat, simple gold brooch, incredibly tight schedule, methodically and politely moving entirely through local dignitaries, completely without absolutely ever looking like she desperately wanted entirely to absolutely be somewhere completely else. That specific woman has dutifully done significantly more official engagements entirely than absolutely anyone else completely in that massive family absolutely every single year entirely for absolutely most entirely of my adult life. And entirely in 5 long decades, there has absolutely not ever been a single valid complaint completely about her professional conduct. At 1:00 p.m., Catherine was actively there, completely too. 2 stands significantly further completely down the long aisle, and that highly specific detail matters immensely, precisely because the beloved Princess of Wales absolutely does completely not actively end entirely up completely at a small, mundane agricultural showcase entirely in June, completely by accident. That was a highly deliberate, strategic decision formally made long weeks entirely in advance, completely by absolutely someone who explicitly wanted a highly specific photograph entirely of the two, entirely of them actively working completely together. The highly respected senior woman and the highly beloved future queen actively working the exact same ordinary room. There is a massive, deliberate message entirely in that specific image, and absolutely everyone completely inside the massive palace deeply understood what it was. This massive family has completely spent 29 long years constantly, unfairly, actively being aggressively measured against one tragic, absent woman, and the absolute only effective answer it has absolutely ever definitively found is pure, unshakable continuity. An older, highly respected woman who has absolutely never, ever completely put a single foot fatally wrong, proudly standing directly entirely beside a younger, beloved one the entire country has definitively decided it completely trusts. Diana's incredibly long shadow is undeniably the absolute only single reason that specific, orchestrated image explicitly exists entirely at absolutely all. Absolutely somebody highly observant, completely outside the massive palace, completely understood it, completely too. The ravenous press reporters were the highly usual, incredibly small pool. Two tired regional papers, one standard wire photographer, one small broadcast crew actively doing B-roll pictures completely without sound, and one highly unusual freelance photographer completely with a massive long lens, quietly standing incredibly quietly at the absolute very back, completely on the exact diagonal. That highly specific physical position matters immensely, precisely because it was literally the absolute only single spot entirely in that massive crowded hall, completely from which absolutely you can perfectly clearly see the exact faces entirely of two highly protected people actively standing at the specific third stand directly along. He had absolutely been firmly planted there completely since the absolute very moment the heavy doors formally opened. Hold firmly, completely onto that specific damning detail, precisely because I am absolutely coming completely back entirely to him, and it is absolutely not pleasant. At about 1:20 p.m., Laura Lopes confidently came entirely in, completely through a highly restricted side entrance, Camilla's civilian daughter, married name Lopes, 2 children, a quiet career entirely in the elite art world, a civilian woman who has completely spent her entire adult life actively being politely photographed twice a year, and absolutely otherwise explicitly leaving entirely no public trace, completely at absolutely all. Absolutely nobody entirely in that massive hall was actively expecting her, precisely because she was absolutely not formally on the highly restricted working list entirely for the afternoon session, and legally had absolutely no business whatsoever actively being absolutely anywhere entirely near a highly restricted floor. She aggressively came completely through the thick crowd entirely without stopping once, which explicitly tells you she intimately knew precisely where she was aggressively going, and she deliberately stopped about 6 feet directly entirely behind Catherine. She patiently waited entirely for a tiny gap entirely in the polite conversation. She finally got one, and then she aggressively stepped directly forward. Absolutely no polite curtsy, absolutely no formal greeting, absolutely no respectful dropping entirely of her voice, which is precisely what absolutely everyone automatically, instinctively does entirely in a massive room like that, absolutely even when they are incredibly furious, precisely because the incredibly loud acoustics completely under a massive glass roof effortlessly carry a quiet whisper 20 feet. 4 completely separate, unconnected people were physically close enough entirely to clearly hear it. She aggressively, loudly told Catherine that the highly recent, massive changes entirely to the royal estate funding had completely been a highly deliberate, vicious insult entirely to her family, and that absolutely everyone actively involved completely knew what they were maliciously doing. Now abruptly stop and critically look entirely at what that specific action truly is, because the lazy press coverage has aggressively spent an entire week simply calling it an outburst, and it was absolutely nothing entirely of the kind. An emotional outburst actively happens entirely in a quiet corridor or a dark car park, or entirely at the absolute end entirely of a tense lunch when 2 people awkwardly meet completely by pure accident and one has finally had completely enough. A spontaneous outburst absolutely does completely not strictly require a restricted side entrance, a specific name illegally added entirely to a highly restrictive list, and one freelance photographer perfectly standing entirely on the exact diagonal, completely at the absolute back entirely of the hall. Since 1:10 p.m., a civilian woman who was explicitly barred entirely from that specific guest list confidently walked directly completely into a highly public engagement and aggressively, loudly raised a highly private, toxic family money grievance directly entirely in front entirely of the national press. That is absolutely not mere temper. That is a highly calculated, malicious delivery. Catherine absolutely did completely not ever answer her. Absolutely everyone physically present has completely been incredibly, uniformly clear entirely about that. And completely having exhaustively watched 14 long years entirely of that specific woman operating completely and highly public, it absolutely would have completely astonished me entirely if she absolutely ever had. She has absolutely never, ever once generously given a hostile room what it eagerly came completely for. She calmly took half a step backward, rigidly kept her flawless face completely perfectly still, and looked coldly at Laura Lopes. The highly specific, chilling way absolutely you deeply look entirely at a person who has absolutely just incredibly stupidly done something they absolutely cannot ever take completely back. The quiet man, completely from Cumbria, was absolutely still awkwardly holding a seed potato. And then Princess Anne, quietly standing 4 feet entirely to the absolute left, slowly turned completely round. She absolutely did completely not quickly turn straight away, which is the exact specific detail absolutely every single terrified witness has prominently mentioned, and the absolute reason this entire story legally exists entirely at absolutely all. She methodically, calmly adjusted her leather gloves entirely first. One, then the absolute other, methodically pulling the stiff cuff firmly down at the wrist, the highly specific way she has flawlessly done entirely in 1,000 public photographs. Then she stood completely, terrifyingly still entirely for about 3 agonizing seconds. 3 full seconds is an incredibly, terrifyingly very long time, completely in a massive room, entirely with 200 noisy people completely in it. Long enough entirely for the buzzing conversation, completely at the absolute far end, entirely to completely die, completely out entirely on its absolute own. Long enough entirely for a bored broadcast operator entirely to sharply swing a massive camera completely around entirely without absolutely ever being actively told. Someone vividly said, "You could clearly hear the quiet rain lightly hitting the massive glass roof." And I absolutely believe it, precisely because that is precisely what a massive hall like that vividly sounds like entirely, when absolutely everyone violently stops talking at the exact same moment. Then she slowly turned and coldly faced the angry woman. Absolutely no hot anger entirely in it. That is the exact thing normal people definitely find incredibly hard entirely to actively believe, and the highly specific thing that absolutely made the massive maneuver flawlessly work. Her stern expression absolutely did completely not ever change entirely at absolutely all. And she absolutely did completely not ever actively answer the loud accusation. That is the absolute masterful move, and it is incredibly worth slowing completely down, entirely on, precisely because it is undeniably the absolute most incredibly surgical, devastating thing absolutely anyone has absolutely ever actively done, completely and highly public, entirely in that massive family, entirely in 20 long years. Laura Lopes had aggressively come entirely into that massive hall completely with a highly specific toxic grievance entirely about massive money and sprawling estates and perceived unfair family treatment, and absolutely every single loud syllable was explicitly designed entirely to aggressively be actively answered, precisely because an angry answer instantly makes it a highly public dispute, and a highly public dispute inherently has two valid sides, and two valid sides can easily be aggressively reported entirely by the eager tabloids. Princess Anne absolutely did completely not ever give her a side. She coldly asked entirely in a perfectly ordinary, chillingly flat voice whether the highly trained security team had explicitly checked the highly restricted guest list entirely for the afternoon session. That was the absolute, entire, devastating reply. Absolutely not one single word entirely about the disputed funding. Absolutely not one single word entirely about the sprawling family or the massive estates or the perceived insult. One devastating question entirely to the massive room, absolutely, rather than directly entirely to the angry woman, entirely about whether that highly specific person was legally supposed entirely to be physically standing there entirely at absolutely all. She absolutely did completely not actively argue completely with what Laura loudly said. She coldly, publicly queried her absolute legal right entirely to be physically inside the massive building. I have obsessively watched that specific leaked clip significantly more times entirely that is remotely healthy, and it absolutely still actively makes me visibly wince. Absolutely anyone can easily lose a petty argument, actively being loudly told, entirely in front, entirely of the ravenous national press, that the absolute real, massive question is how absolutely you illegally got completely past the front door is a completely different order entirely of thing entirely, and it absolutely does completely not easily wash completely off. This is the specific point entirely where Laura Lopes tragically made her massive second mistake, which was infinitely, significantly much larger entirely than the absolute first. She absolutely should definitely have quietly gone. Absolutely any highly paid advisor completely in that massive building absolutely would instantly have urgently told her entirely to weakly smile, politely apologize profusely entirely for the clumsy intrusion, and quickly walk completely out entirely through the exact same restricted side door she illegally came entirely in completely by. By that specific Thursday, it would inevitably have definitively been a tiny forgotten paragraph completely in the back pages. She aggressively stepped significantly closer entirely instead. Horrified witnesses vividly described her as completely having incredibly gone, significantly very red entirely by that tense stage. She loudly, aggressively told the formidable Princess Royal that she was cowardly hiding completely behind highly outdated, ridiculous protocol. She loudly said that the massive financial audit currently aggressively running completely across the sprawling royal estates was actively being highly deliberately driven entirely to maliciously damage her specific family. And she incredibly loudly said that absolutely everyone completely in that massive palace intimately knew entirely about the highly private secret meetings that had completely been actively taking place entirely with the powerful Prince of Wales. That absolute last explosive accusation, incredibly loudly carried completely across the highly polished floor, entirely to the absolute back entirely of the massive hall where the eager reporters were quietly standing, and three entirely of them frantically went completely for their open notebooks at the exact same time. Let me quickly explain the massive audit, precisely because absolutely everything entirely in this explosive story fundamentally hangs completely off it. A highly formal royal estate audit absolutely has completely nothing whatsoever entirely to actively do completely with absolutely anyone's personal handbag. It is a highly rigorous, strict, line-by-line, massive reconciliation entirely of what a massive estate actually spent against what it was explicitly legally authorized entirely to actually spend exhaustively running completely back entirely for long years. And it explicitly catches two highly specific things: massive money that silently went completely out, entirely with absolutely no legal paperwork completely behind it, and highly specific people who were actively being highly paid entirely for vague work. Absolutely nobody can physically produce absolutely any concrete evidence entirely of. An official audit absolutely does completely not actively accuse absolutely anyone entirely of absolutely anything. It simply produces a highly detailed, massive list entirely of specific items that strictly require a highly detailed explanation, and then it immediately becomes someone's highly stressful job entirely to explicitly explain them. Absolutely, somebody highly placed entirely in that massive family had completely been explicitly told entirely to fully expect that specific damning list. And the loud camera shutter had completely been frantically going the absolute entire agonizing time. That highly specific freelance completely at the absolute back entirely with the massive long lens had actively been frantically firing completely since the absolute exact moment Laura aggressively stepped completely forward. And entirely in a massive hall, completely with a massive glass roof and a cold stone floor. The incredibly loud sound entirely of a massive professional body aggressively firing at 8 loud frames entirely a second is absolutely not subtle, completely at absolutely all. Two people quietly standing entirely near him clearly said the exact same specific thing. He absolutely did completely not ever move his physical position once. He absolutely did completely not frantically swing completely around entirely to blindly find the perfect shot. He was completely already perfectly on it. A normal photographer absolutely does completely not ever actually get that incredibly lucky. A highly specific photographer explicitly gets formally told. Princess Anne absolutely did completely not ever raise her flat voice entirely at absolutely any point. She simply coldly lifted one gloved hand about 6 inches, which is the highly specific, subtle signal her highly trained protection officer has completely been flawlessly reading entirely for 30 long years. And the massive silent man aggressively came completely through the shocked crowd entirely without absolutely ever hurrying, and coldly, firmly asked Laura entirely to physically step completely out entirely to the massive lobby, and coldly told her that her specific, unauthorized presence at the restricted event was absolutely no longer entirely appropriate. The absolute, entire, explosive thing, completely from the very first angry sentence entirely to the heavy closing doors, actively ran completely under 2 minutes. 2 minutes, and it exhaustingly took a full fortnight entirely of massive institutional machinery completely to furiously deal entirely with, precisely because here is what absolutely everyone entirely in that massive room intimately understood completely by the exact time they finally got completely to their waiting cars. That was absolutely not a messy family argument that accidentally happened entirely to simply occur completely in highly public. That was a highly toxic family argument, highly deliberately staged, completely and highly public, explicitly in front, entirely of a highly specific photographer who was mysteriously booked at a highly restricted event where the absolute two most highly protected women, completely in that massive institution, were standing 8 feet completely apart, completely on the exact specific week that a massive, terrifying financial audit was actively moving it entirely to the specific part where absolutely someone absolutely would finally have entirely to actually start explicitly explaining difficult things. And the absolute very first panicked question that frantically went completely round the long corridors entirely of that massive palace was absolutely not entirely about the angry words entirely at absolutely all. It was intensely how she illegally got entirely in. Security completely at the massive front entirely of that highly secure building was incredibly tight. A highly accredited vetted list, strictly printed, unforgeable badges, a massive, rigorous checkpoint at the main entrance, entirely staffed completely by highly serious people who routinely actively turn completely away powerful peers entirely of the realm, absolutely without absolutely even blinking if the specific name is absolutely not on the official sheet. The terrified staff immediately went completely to the digital access logs that highly tense evening, and what they quickly found actively took about 11 terrifying minutes. A highly restricted VIP invitation had actively been quietly issued entirely locally, absolutely not completely by the massive palace, absolutely not completely by the formal household, absolutely not entirely through absolutely any entirely of the 4 strict offices that are explicitly supposed entirely to legally sign, completely off, completely on attendance at a restricted event, completely with 2 senior working royals, physically entirely in the room. It entirely came directly, completely from the highly regional director, entirely of the specific organization, actively hosting the massive showcase. A highly quiet man, completely in his late 60s, completely with an incredibly long, deep connection, entirely to that specific part entirely of the country, and a highly distant, quiet social acquaintance, completely with Camilla's specific family heavily going completely back entirely for long years. He had quietly been explicitly asked incredibly late as a highly personal favor entirely to illegally add one more restricted name completely to the highly restrictive list entirely by hand. He was completely, unceremoniously suspended completely before nightfall. The highly illegal invitation was officially logged as a massive Tier 1 accreditation breach, which completely in that highly secure world is undeniably the absolute most highly serious catastrophic category there absolutely is. The exact specific one explicitly reserved entirely for a massive failure that aggressively put a highly protected person completely in a room entirely with someone absolutely nobody had properly checked. And entirely in the absolute middle entirely of absolutely all entirely of that massive chaos, completely on a highly secure conference call entirely somewhere else completely entirely, the powerful Prince of Wales was quietly, factually told what had shockingly happened. He abruptly ended the massive call completely mid-sentence. The stunned people entirely on the absolute other end clearly described that as the absolute single most incredibly out-of-character thing that specific man has absolutely ever actively done completely in highly public life. He absolutely does completely not actively do that. He is undeniably the absolute most incredibly procedurally polite person completely in that massive institution. A man who formally thanks a massive room completely before he finally leaves it, absolutely even when the massive room has incredibly wasted a full hour entirely of his valuable time. I urgently want you entirely to deeply understand what he was intensely looking at completely on that secure screen, precisely because it was absolutely not a mere security lapse. He was coldly watching a highly protected woman actively get aggressively approached completely in highly public, explicitly in front, entirely of a mysteriously booked photographer, entirely by someone directly connected entirely to a highly toxic family, completely with a massive financial grievance, completely on a specific week when the hungry press had completely been incredibly quietly, maliciously primed. He has painfully, repeatedly seen that exact same toxic sequence relentlessly run completely before, entirely on Diana, completely across, absolutely most entirely of his traumatized childhood, and it horribly finished the tragic way it inevitably finished. He coldly put the secure phone completely down, firmly told his highly loyal chief of staff entirely to aggressively get the absolute raw, completely unedited, full footage, completely from the highly suspicious freelance, and explicitly made it incredibly, terrifyingly clear that the absolute price absolutely did completely not ever matter completely at all. Absolutely not the curated pictures that had completely already actively gone completely out. The massive, raw, unedited digital card. Absolutely everything completely before and entirely after the specific frames that were actively going entirely to inevitably run. Because what actually happens entirely in the highly critical 90 seconds completely before a specific person aggressively steps completely forward clearly tells you whether they were merely walking innocently or whether they were actively, maliciously waiting. That highly specific instruction clearly tells you what he was actively doing, which was absolutely not mere damage control. A panicked man, desperately handling a messy public relations problem, frantically asks entirely for the published images and urgently demands a slick line entirely to give the ravenous press. A highly furious man who coldly asks entirely for the absolute raw, unedited digital card is aggressively building a massive permanent legal file. He silently watched it completely in his highly secure office, completely with the bright lights firmly off. The quiet people who were physically entirely in that massive building clearly described the heavy atmosphere completely in one chilling word, and the specific word is cold. Absolutely not loud shouting, absolutely not violently slamming doors, pure cold. He quietly sat and coldly watched a civilian woman aggressively cross a massive hall entirely toward his heavily protected wife. And he coldly watched the stunned crowd actively react. And he coldly watched the absolute exact, precise moment his formidable aunt slowly turned completely round. When it finally finished, he absolutely did completely not actually say absolutely anything entirely for an incredibly very long while. Then he quietly picked completely up the highly secure, encrypted line entirely to his father. He absolutely did completely not politely ask entirely for absolutely any permission. That is the massive part that truly matters. And absolutely everyone, completely and absolutely both massive households, acutely noticed it. He calmly, factually briefed the tired king completely on what had explosively happened, completely on how she had illegally got completely in, completely on what it was absolutely going entirely to look completely like entirely in the brutal morning papers, and that he firmly told him that he was actively taking the massive disciplinary process entirely on himself. The quiet king simply listened. He absolutely did completely not actively argue. He simply told his heir entirely to aggressively do absolutely whatever was completely necessary, entirely to fiercely protect the massive institution. I eagerly want entirely to sit completely on that brief exchange entirely for a quick second, precisely because there is a whole massive reign contained entirely inside it. A tired man entirely in his late 70s, highly unwell, currently married entirely to a highly controversial woman whose civilian daughter had incredibly walked completely into a highly public engagement and aggressively gone entirely at his absolute own son's highly popular wife, smoothly handing his absolute own son the absolute complete authority entirely to aggressively deal completely with it, and completely permanently staying entirely out entirely of the messy room. He absolutely did completely not actively defend absolutely anyone. He absolutely did completely not desperately ask entirely for absolutely more time. He intimately knew precisely what he had completely been handed, and he calmly handed it completely straight, entirely on. William aggressively went entirely into the highly secure basement briefing room at 5 minutes, completely without absolutely even taking his heavy coat entirely off. 5 highly senior aides were completely already actively sitting entirely there, absolutely each completely with a heavy folder directly in front, entirely of them containing a highly sanitized version entirely of the explosive day, written completely from absolutely whichever direction they had nervously watched it. He confidently walked entirely to the absolute middle, entirely of the massive mahogany table, coldly put his secure phone completely down, entirely on it, hard enough entirely to be loudly heard, and coldly picked completely up the remote. He aggressively played the massive raw footage completely on the large wall. Absolutely nobody said a single word while it actively ran. The loud, aggressive camera shutter is perfectly audible completely on the raw audio, which is the highly specific, damning detail that permanently finished the massive argument completely before absolutely anyone absolutely even made it. And the incredibly loud, aggressive sound entirely of a massive professional camera violently firing at 8 loud frames entirely a second completely filled that quiet briefing room entirely for about 40 agonizing seconds. He coldly turned the bright projector completely off. Then he coldly asked the absolute only single question he had actually come completely there entirely to aggressively ask, which was how a highly controversial civilian woman who had completely been actively kept entirely off the highly restricted working list entirely for the absolute better part entirely of a full year had incredibly, illegally walked completely into a highly secured hall actively containing 2 highly protected senior working royals. He intensely looked at the terrified director entirely of security while he coldly asked it. The panicked man frantically began a messy explanation. William brutally stopped him about 6 terrified words entirely in and coldly said he absolutely did completely not ever want an explanation. He absolutely wanted a specific name. He aggressively wanted the specific person who had completely made it physically possible, explicitly identified entirely in that highly secure room entirely that very evening, and he aggressively wanted them completely out entirely of their lucrative post, completely off the highly restricted premises, and heavily, formally reminded completely in harsh writing entirely of what they had legally signed, completely before the very first newspaper edition absolutely even landed. This is where it permanently stops, absolutely being simply about one messy afternoon entirely in Westminster, precisely because that is absolutely not how a highly powerful man behaves entirely about a simple minor security lapse entirely at a boring flower show. He had aggressively spent the absolute previous 2 months incredibly quietly, ruthlessly working completely through the massive households, actively moving highly connected people, completely out entirely of key positions, aggressively closing completely off the highly informal toxic back channels that have seamlessly run completely through that massive building entirely for 20 long years. Absolutely everyone highly senior completely in that massive palace intimately knew it was actively happening, and absolutely most entirely of them had desperately decided entirely to quietly keep their heads firmly down until it was finally finished. That explosive afternoon clearly told him it was absolutely not completely finished, and that absolutely whatever he had completely been actively clearing, completely out, absolutely still had a highly active hand completely on a vital door. One entirely of the terrified aides desperately tried entirely to weakly place the massive blame at a safe distance. The highly illegal invitation had supposedly come entirely from a minor regional branch, he weakly said. An entirely outside organization, absolutely not the massive royal household. William coldly asked him whether that specific minor regional branch had completely been explicitly, formally briefed completely on the highly strict standing arrangements regarding Camilla's highly controversial family. The terrified aide slowly nodded, precisely because it absolutely had. He coldly asked why the strict briefing had completely been utterly ignored. The panicked man nervously moved entirely in his chair and weakly said there had completely been intense pressure entirely from significantly high above. William coldly asked entirely for a specific name. The highly tense room went completely, utterly quiet. Absolutely nobody entirely in it said absolutely anything entirely at absolutely all. Then he aggressively reached entirely for a heavy folder that had completely been actively sitting entirely on the mahogany table, completely since entirely before he absolutely even came completely in. It had a highly restricted red tag, strictly limited circulation, and a title completely on the front that clearly tells you significantly more entirely about the highly toxic state entirely of that massive institution entirely than absolutely anything else completely in this entire story. Internal influences, Absolutely, somebody completely in that massive building meticulously keeps a highly updated, massive list entirely of the highly informal, toxic relationships that actively cut entirely across the highly rigid official structure. Quiet marriages, highly obscure old jobs, distant cousins, a highly placed junior manager entirely in one busy office, directly related entirely to a highly senior assistant completely in another. It is absolutely not a messy tabloid scandal document. Absolutely every single massive complex organization explicitly has a sanitized version entirely of it. And completely in that specific one, it legally exists precisely because the highly rigid official chart has absolutely never, ever once accurately described how absolutely anything actually gets completely done. It quickly took him entirely under a single minute entirely to flawlessly find a damning connection. A highly placed, mid-level manager entirely in the massive palace administration, completely quietly married, entirely to a highly connected personal assistant, actively working completely inside Camilla's highly private household. He violently closed the heavy folder, looked intensely at the terrified director entirely of security, and coldly said one single, devastating sentence. Entirely within 20 short minutes, the specific man was actively walking completely out, entirely through the highly restricted back gates, completely with two large, silent security officers physically directly beside him, actively carrying absolutely nothing completely at all. At 5:30, entirely in the busy afternoon, directly past stunned people, he had actively worked completely with entirely for 11 long years. The massive, undeniable message immediately went completely round that entire building significantly faster, entirely than absolutely any typed memo has absolutely ever traveled entirely in it. The powerful Prince of Wales had completely permanently stopped being the patient heir who absolutely would simply passively deal completely with absolutely all entirely of this, eventually. He was aggressively, ruthlessly dealing completely with it now. While absolutely all entirely of that was actively, aggressively moving completely in a secure basement entirely in London, Princess Anne was quietly sitting completely in the quiet back entirely of a highly secure car. She absolutely did completely not ever use her secure phone. She absolutely did completely not ever speak entirely to her trusted aide. She simply sat quietly, completely with her hands neatly folded, entirely on her simple bag, and intensely looked completely straight ahead entirely through absolutely most entirely of the long drive. The specific person, completely in that quiet car, completely with her later, clearly said she was absolutely not visibly upset entirely in absolutely any way that publicly showed. She was meticulously, ruthlessly going completely back entirely through absolutely every single detail entirely of it. The exact, precise timing entirely of the highly illegal entry, the highly specific, tiny gap entirely in the polite conversation the angry woman had patiently waited entirely for, the exact, highly specific wording she had explicitly used, and the absolute exact order she had explicitly used it completely in, the exact, highly suspicious physical position entirely of the massive cameras when it initially started. Strict protocol absolutely does completely not ever mean mere manners entirely to that specific woman. Absolute protocol is undeniably the massive structural load-bearing wall entirely of the absolute entire ancient building. Absolutely every single rigid rule entirely about who stands where and who is on which restricted list officially exists precisely because 200 long years ago, absolutely, someone astutely worked completely out that the absolute only thing fundamentally separating a massive monarchy completely from a highly permanent bloody argument is a highly rigid written order entirely of strict precedence that absolutely nobody is absolutely ever legally allowed entirely to simply improvise casually around. She finally spoke, and it was entirely to coldly ask about the highly specific regional director who had illegally issued the massive invitation. Absolutely not entirely about Laura, absolutely not entirely about her mother, purely about the specific man at the restricted door. Security absolutely always starts entirely at the absolute front entrance, she coldly said, and that was the absolute entire, complete comment. Now there is a massive, terrifying question entirely underneath absolutely all entirely of this that literally took me 2 full days entirely to finally work completely out, and once I clearly saw it, I absolutely could completely not ever unsee it. Princess Anne easily could have instantly stopped that highly public confrontation entirely in about 4 short seconds. She constantly has a massive, highly trained protection officer securely standing 8 feet completely away, entirely at absolutely all times. She possesses 50 long years entirely of massive, unquestioned authority completely in any room. One slightly raised hand at the very first angry sentence, and that angry woman is physically entirely in the quiet lobby, completely before the very second sentence completely leaves her furious mouth, and absolutely nobody entirely in the massive press pool absolutely ever gets significantly more entirely than a blurry frame and a messy, unconfirmed rumor. She deliberately, highly calculatedly let it completely run. She calmly stood there and deliberately let an angry woman clearly say 3 full, highly damning sentences completely in front entirely of 24 hungry reporters, and absolutely only finally moved when the absolute last entirely of them was entirely out. This is my highly specific reading absolutely rather than absolutely anyone's fully confirmed official account. And I absolutely will clearly say that once and then quietly get completely out entirely of the way. I absolutely do completely not ever think she momentarily froze, and I absolutely do completely not ever think she was simply gathering herself. I firmly, deeply think she aggressively wanted entirely to clearly hear the absolute whole, massive thing, entirely in highly public, completely with highly credible witnesses and a high-definition recording actively running, precisely because a toxic grievance aggressively shouted entirely in a quiet corridor is completely deniable, and a toxic grievance aggressively delivered completely in front entirely of the national press is absolute ironclad evidence entirely of a highly specific toxic state entirely of mind. She deliberately, coldly let the highly angry woman completely finish actively building the massive legal case entirely against absolutely herself. Then entirely in the quiet car, she coldly asked her trusted aide entirely for the full, detailed attendance list. Absolutely not the highly curated, accredited press list. The absolute full, highly detailed attendance list entirely for the entire afternoon session. The highly specific one that fully includes absolutely all local guests and highly specific organizational invitations, hastily printed completely out, entirely on the long way completely back, precisely because the trusted aide completely already had it completely on a secure tablet. There were 3 highly specific names completely on it that she instantly, chillingly recognized completely immediately. 3 highly specific regional journalists, absolutely none, entirely of them, actively from the highly vetted main royal pool. Absolutely all 3, entirely of them completely with an incredibly long and highly friendly, cozy relationship, completely with highly connected people, completely around Camilla's specific family, and absolutely all 3 entirely of them conspicuously standing in a massive hall, entirely in Westminster, completely on a random Tuesday afternoon, entirely for a highly obscure rural development showcase that absolutely would normally, absolutely only ever be incredibly lightly covered entirely by one board wire photographer and a local stringer. That is the absolute exact moment it permanently stopped entirely being an isolated incident. 3 highly friendly placed journalists, 1 suspicious freelance completely on the exact diagonal, completely with a massive long lens, one highly unauthorized name explicitly added entirely to a highly restricted list, entirely by hand at the absolute very last minute, and a highly angry civilian woman who confidently walked completely in, entirely through a restricted side door, and aggressively went directly entirely to the highly specific third stand, directly along. Absolutely none entirely of that is mere spontaneous temper. Absolutely all entirely of it is a highly coordinated, incredibly malicious schedule. Princess Anne had completely been the highly specific, active target entirely of the toxic thing that aggressively produced it entirely for long months. She had completely already aggressively, successfully blocked two separate massive attempts entirely to quietly change the highly strict management rules completely on highly lucrative estate properties. She had forcefully, rigidly insisted completely on a massive full forensic audit absolutely, rather than the highly superficial, light review that had initially been smoothly proposed. Absolutely every single time, absolutely someone completely in that highly ambitious orbit had actively tried entirely to quietly loosen a strict rule entirely about how the massive, lucrative land is actively run and who massively benefits completely from it. The exact same formidable woman had completely been unyieldingly standing entirely in the quiet corridor, completely with the absolute original, binding documents firmly in her absolute hand. Highly ambitious people who aggressively spend long years desperately trying entirely to quietly move a massive wall absolutely eventually, inevitably decide entirely to maliciously move the specific person stubbornly leaning completely against it entirely instead. By the exact time the quiet car finally reached London, she had completely moved entirely on, completely to the absolute part that fundamentally mattered absolutely most. And this is the terrifying part, absolutely nobody has accurately reported absolutely anywhere. The massive financial audit was incredibly, highly confidential, absolutely not simply discreet. Highly confidential entirely in the incredibly specific institutional sense, which explicitly means the absolute total number entirely of highly cleared people who intimately knew it actually existed was 4, and she could easily, accurately name absolutely all 4 entirely of them. And a highly angry, unauthorized civilian woman had aggressively walked completely into a highly public hall that very afternoon and incredibly loudly referred entirely to it completely out loud, explicitly in front entirely of hungry reporters. Absolutely somebody highly placed had explicitly told that specific highly toxic family it was aggressively coming. She sat quietly, completely in the quiet back entirely of that secure car and methodically, coldly worked completely through the entire massive timeline, who had absolutely known what and on which highly specific day. She chillingly came completely out entirely of it, completely with an absolute answer she absolutely did, completely not ever like entirely at absolutely all, which is that the absolute most highly likely, devastating route explicitly ran, completely straight, entirely through her absolute own brother's absolute own private office. She actively made one highly secure telephone call completely before she absolutely even got entirely out entirely of the car, an incredibly old, highly secure contact, a highly connected person she has intimately known completely for long decades entirely from a highly shadowy world that absolutely does completely not ever appear entirely in absolutely any polite court circular. And the highly specific request was incredibly narrow and highly specific. A massive, highly forensic trace completely on the highly encrypted digital correspondence specifically relating entirely to the massive audit. Absolutely not the actual contents, simply the digital routing. She fiercely wanted entirely to definitively know which specific building the highly sensitive information had completely left entirely from.